The gunshot split the dawn like
What
a
is it,
thunderclap,
darling?
sending crows scattering into the pale Colorado sky.
Easy.
Mason Blackwood
What do
lay
you
flat
see?
against the cold ground, the worn stock of his Winchester pressed against his cheek, the familiar smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. Through the rifle's iron sights, he tracked the second rustler, who was scrambling for cover among the pines. The man's horse reared, panicked by the sound of the shot that had dropped his partner. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. "Stop right there," he called out, his voice carrying across the frost-covered pasture. The rustler froze, hands slowly rising. The cattle they'd been trying to steal milled nervously nearby, breath steaming in the cold morning air. "I'm just hired help," the man stammered. "Don't shoot." Mason rose to his feet, rifle still aimed. "Then your employer picked the wrong ranch." He nodded toward the tree line. "Ride out. Don't come back." The man needed no second invitation. As hoofbeats faded into the distance, Mason approached the fallen rustler, rifle ready. The man lay face down, hat tumbled aside, revealing a shock of dirty blonde hair. Mason nudged him with his boot, confirming what he already knew. No pulse, no threat. Methodically, he checked the dead man's pockets, a few dollars, tobacco, matches. On the man's belt buckle, Mason's fingers traced an engraving. TR. His jaw tightened. Thompson Reed. The gang had been terrorizing the county for months, but this was the first time they'd come for his stock. Mason dragged the body to his horse. Some men might leave such remains for the scavengers, but that wasn't his way. Death deserved dignity, even for thieves. He'd take the body to town, report to Sheriff Callahan. The rustler's horse he caught easily. It would fetch a fair price at market. By the time Mason returned to his ranch house, the sun had fully risen over the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the two-story wooden structure he'd built with his own hands. The fences stood firm, mended after each harsh winter. The barn's door needed fixing, but it could wait. Everything here represented 6 years of brutal work since he'd claimed this land after the war. Sheriff Callahan was waiting on the porch, hat in hand, his gray mustache twitching with concern. "Heard a shot," he said without preamble. Mason dismounted, the dead rustler slung across his saddle. "Thompson Reed," he replied, pointing to the belt buckle. "Came for my north herd?" Callahan inspected the body, his weathered face grim. "Third incident this week. They're getting bolder." He looked up, meeting Mason's eyes. "They're not just stealing cattle, Mason. They're building an empire. 3 ranches burned last month." Mason unsaddled his horse, movements efficient from years of practice. "I'm not looking for trouble, Jim. Trouble's looking for you." Callahan watched as Mason led his horse to the water trough. "Word is Thompson's got plans for this valley. Railroads coming through and land prices are about to soar." A high-pitched voice broke their conversation. "Papa!" Sophie Blackwood, 4 years old with unruly curls bouncing behind her, burst through the front door and ran across the yard, barefoot despite the morning chill. Mason's face softened instantly. He caught her mid-run, swinging her into his arms. "What have I told you about shoes, little one?" She giggled, unconcerned. Her eyes, the same deep blue as her mother's had been, sparkled with childish excitement. "I fed the chickens all by myself." "That's so." Mason set her down, noticing Callahan discreetly covering the dead man with a blanket. Some sights weren't for children's eyes. "I should get this body to town," Callahan said, mounting his horse and taking the rustler's reins. "You watch yourself, Mason. Thompson Reed won't take kindly to losing one of their men." Mason nodded, one hand resting protectively on Sophie's shoulder. "We'll manage." After Callahan departed, the day unfolded with the rhythm of ranch life. Mason mended fences, checked the herd, and chopped firewood while Sophie chatted endlessly at his side, her small hands trying to help with every task. She was too young to remember her mother, who died bringing her into this world. Sometimes that felt like a blessing. The following morning brought an unexpected sight. Mason stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, scanning his property as was his habit. Movement at the end of the long drive caught his eye. A woman walking slowly, her clothes dusty from the trail. She carried a bundle in her arms, cradled protectively against her chest. Mason set down his coffee, hand instinctively moving to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. After yesterday's incident, he wasn't taking chances. The woman came steadily closer. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with auburn hair partially covered by a worn bonnet. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she carried herself with dignity. The bundle in her arms shifted, revealing an infant. Before Mason could intercept her, Sophie darted past him, racing down the steps toward the stranger. "Sophie!" he called sharply. "Get back here!" But his daughter ignored him, skidding to a halt in front of the woman. The stranger froze, uncertainty crossing her face. Sophie tilted her head, studying the woman with childish curiosity. She reached out, touching the hem of the woman's skirt, then leaned in and sniffed. A smile of pure satisfaction spread across her face as she turned back to Mason. "She smells like Mama," she declared. Mason's world tilted. In 2 years, Sophie had never mentioned her mother, not once. The words hit him like a physical blow, unlocking something raw and buried deep. The woman lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly, shifting the infant in her arms. "I didn't mean to intrude." Mason approached slowly, his gaze sweeping over her. Closer now, he could see the exhaustion etched in her face, the frayed edges of her dress, the way her hands trembled slightly despite her composed expression. "I'm Charlotte Hayes," she said before he could speak. "This is my son, Michael." The infant stirred at the sound of his name, making a small, hungry noise. She hushed him gently, swaying side to side. "What brings you to my ranch, Mrs. Hayes?" Mason asked, voice deliberately neutral. "I was traveling to Denver. Our stagecoach was attacked 3 days ago. The driver—" She paused, composing herself. "He didn't survive. I ran into the woods with Michael. We've been walking ever since." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Attacked by whom?" "Men with bandanas. 6 of them." She met his gaze steadily. One had a silver belt buckle with initials. "TR," Mason said. Not a question. Charlotte nodded, surprise flickering across her face. "Is anyone looking for you?" Mason asked, the implication clear. "No, sir. No one's looking." Her voice caught but didn't falter. Sophie, still standing close to Charlotte, stared up at the infant with wonder. "Can he talk yet?" she asked softly. Charlotte shook her head, almost smiling. "Not yet." Mason studied the woman, weighing risks against conscience. Thunder Creek was still 5 miles west. Night would fall before she reached it, especially with a child. Mountain lions hunted these forests after dark. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," he finally said. "It's not much, but it's warm." Charlotte blinked, clearly surprised. "You mean it?" "I don't say what I don't mean." He glanced at Sophie, still entranced by the baby. "And she doesn't usually say that kind of thing." Sophie beamed as if she'd accomplished something important. Mason gestured toward the small structure behind the main house. "Come on, I'll show you around." The bunkhouse was modest but solid. 4 walls, a wood stove, a cot barely wide enough for one adult, and a baby. To Charlotte, who had spent 3 nights hiding in the forest, it felt like a palace. By the second morning, she had tied an old apron around her waist and stepped into Mason's kitchen without being asked. Her fingers, calloused from what Mason guessed was years of hard work, moved efficiently as she kneaded dough and scrubbed pots clean. Sophie followed Charlotte everywhere, fascinated by baby Michael, who rarely cried. He remained strapped to Charlotte's back during chores, watching everything with alert eyes. From the barn doorway, Mason observed Charlotte hanging laundry, her movements quick and practiced. She'd fixed the broken hinge on the back door without being told. When she noticed Sophie's dress was too tight, she restitched the seams with thread pulled from an old curtain. Mason said little, mostly nodded when their paths crossed. But that evening, when Charlotte served a stew that somehow made his tough beef tender, he found himself watching her hands as she worked. Strong hands, capable, not soft like his Rebecca's had been. "You ride?" he asked abruptly when she cleared his plate. Charlotte looked up, surprised by the sudden question. "Yes, my father insisted I learn." "And shoot?" A flicker of something, pride perhaps, crossed her face. "Reasonably well." The next morning, Mason set up empty bottles along the fence rail. Charlotte joined him, Michael secured to her back, Sophie watching from the porch steps. "A woman alone should know how to defend herself," Mason said, handing her his Colt revolver. It looked oversized in her hands, but she checked the chamber with practiced ease before taking aim. Her first shot missed. The second clipped a bottle's edge. The third shattered glass. "Don't aim where they are," Mason instructed, adjusting her stance. "Aim where they're going to be." Charlotte nodded, understanding. Her next 3 shots broke 3 bottles in succession. "Who taught you?" Mason asked as they walked back to the house. "My father was a doctor in St. Louis. He believed in preparation." She hesitated. "He served as a field surgeon during the war." Mason's hand unconsciously touched the long scar that ran down his left cheek. "Which side?" "Union, 19th Illinois." Mason nodded. "I rode with the 7th Cavalry, saw action at Gettysburg." Something shifted between them, a mutual recognition of shared history, of understanding what the war had cost this country. That night, they sat on the porch after Sophie had gone to bed, the silence between them no longer awkward, but companionable. "My husband was a merchant," Charlotte said unprompted. "When his business failed, he changed, became cruel." She rocked Michael gently in her arms. "He left when I told him about the baby. No note, just gone." Mason stared into the darkness beyond the porch light. "Rebecca, my wife, died the day after Sophie was born. She bled too much. I rode 15 miles in the dark for a doctor." His voice roughened. "He came too late." Charlotte didn't offer empty sympathies, and Mason appreciated that more than she could know. 5 days became 10, 10 became 20. Charlotte and Michael settled into the rhythm of the ranch. Mason found himself rising earlier each morning, taking more care with his appearance, though he wouldn't have admitted why. Then came the storm, and with it, fever. Sophie woke in the night, her skin burning hot, breath ragged. Charlotte rushed from the bunkhouse, carrying Michael, and found the child tangled in her blankets, crying for her mother. Without hesitation, Charlotte dampened cloths and placed them on Sophie's forehead, humming softly as she rocked the girl. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the small bedroom in brief, ghostly flashes. When Mason woke to the sounds, he found Charlotte on the kitchen floor, both children asleep against her. Sophie's fever broken, her breathing steady, her small hand clutching Charlotte's sleeve. Michael slept peacefully on her other side. Mason stood motionless in the doorway. Something inside him shifted, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. Wordlessly, he lifted a blanket and covered all 3, his hand lingering a moment on Charlotte's shoulder before he withdrew to the porch, where he remained until dawn. The trouble in town came soon after. Mason had avoided bringing Charlotte to Thunder Creek, but supplies ran low, and they all made the journey together. The general store fell silent when they entered. Mason, Charlotte with Michael strapped to her chest, and Sophie holding Charlotte's hand. Victoria Wells, a wealthy widow known for her sharp tongue and sharper business sense, blocked their path as they prepared to leave. Her silk dress and gold jewelry stood in stark contrast to Charlotte's simple cotton garments. My, she said, eyeing Charlotte with undisguised contempt. The Lord surely blesses some more than others. A roof, employment, a man's home. Her gaze slid to Mason. Tell me, Blackwood, is this one of those arrangements where help means something else entirely? The store fell silent. Charlotte stiffened, color draining from her face. Sophie pressed closer to her skirt, sensing the tension. Mason didn't raise his voice. He turned to Charlotte, adjusted Michael's blanket with quiet care, then faced Victoria. She works harder than anyone in this town, he said, each word clear and measured. And Sophie never smiled the way she does until Charlotte walked through my gate. Victoria blinked, clearly unprepared for his response. You can pray about that if you like, Mason added. Then he took Charlotte's hand, not tightly, just enough to make his position clear, and walked out into the sunlight, Sophie skipping ahead. They were halfway home before Charlotte spoke. You didn't have to defend me. I know, Mason replied simply. That evening, as Charlotte prepared dinner, Sheriff Callahan arrived at the ranch, his expression grave. Thompson Reed men were asking about a woman with a baby in town today, he said quietly while Sophie played out of earshot. Said she witnessed something she shouldn't have. Charlotte's hand stilled at the stove. Mason watched her shoulders tense. What did they witness, Mrs. Hayes? Callahan asked gently. Charlotte turned, her face pale but composed. Victor Thompson shot the territorial governor 3 days ago on the Denver road. I saw it happen from the stagecoach window. They killed our driver when he tried to flee, but I escaped with Michael during the confusion. Mason exhaled slowly. So it's not just cattle rustling anymore. Callahan shook his head. Thompson wants to control this entire valley before the railroad comes through. The governor was here to investigate complaints. He turned to Charlotte. You're the only witness, ma'am. That night after Callahan left, Mason began fortifying the ranch. He cleaned every gun, stockpiled ammunition, and reinforced doors and windows. Charlotte watched him work, Michael sleeping against her shoulder. We should leave, she said finally. I can't let you and Sophie be in danger because of me. Mason continued loading shotgun shells. I ran once in my life, after Rebecca died. I won't run again. He looked up, meeting her eyes. This is our home. The plural wasn't lost on Charlotte. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she nodded, resolution replacing fear. Then show me what else I can do to help defend it. For 3 days they prepared. Mason dug trenches at strategic points around the property, set tripwires connected to bells, and taught Charlotte how to use the Winchester. They slept in shifts, one always on watch. Sophie seemed to think it was all a game, helping to gather supplies and hide them in the root cellar that doubled as a shelter. On the 4th morning, dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Mason counted 12 riders through his field glass. At the front rode a tall man with a silver beard, Victor Thompson himself. Beside him was a younger man Mason didn't recognize, better dressed than the others. That's Edwin, Charlotte whispered, her voice tight. My husband. Mason's jaw clenched. Get Sophie and Michael to the cellar. There's a tunnel at the back that leads to the creek. If things go wrong, follow it north to town. Charlotte grabbed his arm. Be careful, she said, eyes holding his for a long moment before she hurried to gather the children. Mason positioned himself on the porch, rifle visible but not aimed as the riders approached. They stopped 30 yards out, just beyond effective shotgun range. Smart. Mason Blackwood, Thompson called, his voice carrying across the yard. I hear you're harboring something that belongs to me. Nothing here belongs to you, Thompson, Mason replied evenly. The well-dressed man, Edwin, urged his horse forward. My wife and son are with you. I've come to reclaim my family. Funny time to remember you have one, Mason said, not moving from the porch. Where were you when your son was born? Edwin's face darkened. That's between me and Charlotte. She doesn't want to see you, Mason said. Ride on. Thompson laughed, the sound cold and hollow. We're not asking, Blackwood. The woman saw something she shouldn't have. Either she comes with us, or we burn this place to the ground with everyone inside. Mason's finger moved to the trigger. You're welcome to try. Thompson signaled, and his men spread out. Mason fired first, hitting the rider on the far left. The man tumbled from his saddle as gunfire erupted across the yard. Mason ducked behind the porch pillar as bullets splintered wood around him. He'd fought enough battles to know when he was outnumbered, but he'd also learned that superior numbers didn't always guarantee victory. He triggered the first trap, dynamite buried near the barn. The explosion sent horses rearing and men diving for cover. Using the confusion, Mason sprinted to the water trough, firing methodically at exposed positions. Another rider fell. A bullet grazed Mason's arm as he ran for the shelter of the barn. Pain flared, hot and immediate, but he'd felt worse at Gettysburg. Inside, he grabbed the second rifle he'd hidden and climbed to the hayloft. From this elevation, he could see 3 men approaching the house from behind. Mason's shots dropped 2. The third dove through the kitchen window. Charlotte, Michael, Sophie. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs as he scrambled down the ladder. Inside the house, Charlotte had heard the breaking glass. She positioned Sophie and Michael behind her in the cellar, raising the revolver Mason had given her. When Edwin's face appeared at the top of the stairs, she didn't hesitate. The shot caught him in the leg. He stumbled, cursing, as blood soaked through his expensive trousers. "You bitch," he snarled, dragging himself down the steps despite his wound. "That boy is mine. He has a name. Blood. A real family waiting in Kansas." Charlotte kept the gun level. "The only family he knows is here." Outside, Mason was pinned down by gunfire from Thompson and his remaining men. A bullet had found his shoulder, and blood ran hot down his arm, weakening his grip on the rifle. Thompson advanced, revolver aimed at Mason's chest. "You can't save everyone, Blackwood." The gunshot that followed didn't come from Thompson's weapon. It came from behind him, tearing through his shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Charlotte stood in the doorway, Mason's Winchester smoking in her hands. "I don't need saving," she said. "I saved myself." Thompson's men, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat. In the distance, hoofbeats approached. Sheriff Callahan with a posse from town, drawn by the gunfire. Mason struggled to his feet, pressing a hand to his wounded shoulder. Charlotte rushed to his side, supporting his weight as they watched Thompson's men flee. "Edwin?" Mason asked through gritted teeth. "Locked in the cellar," Charlotte replied. "Shot in the leg. He'll live to face a judge." Sheriff Callahan arrived as Charlotte was helping Mason to the house. The lawman's eyes widened at the bodies scattered across the yard. "Looks like you two held your own." "She's a hell of a shot," Mason managed, fighting to stay conscious as blood loss took its toll. Inside, Charlotte laid Mason on the kitchen table and cut away his shirt. The bullet had lodged in his shoulder, deep but not fatal, if infection didn't set in. "I need hot water, whiskey, and your sharpest knife," she instructed Callahan. To Mason, she said more softly, "This will hurt." Mason's eyes held hers. "I trust you." With steady hands that belied her fear, Charlotte extracted the bullet using skills learned from her father. Mason remained conscious throughout, his jaw clenched against the pain, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. Later, as fever set in, Mason drifted between consciousness and delirium. Charlotte sat by his bedside, changing compresses and spooning broth between his cracked lips. In his fever dreams, he called for Rebecca, apologizing for not saving her, for not being faster, better. Charlotte held his hand through it all, her voice a constant anchor in his storm of memories. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. "Neither of us is." 3 days passed before Mason's fever broke. When he finally opened clear eyes, it was dawn. Charlotte had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her hands still clasping his. Sophie was curled against her side, and Michael slept in a makeshift cradle nearby. For the first time since Rebecca died, Mason felt something like peace settle over him. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it. Recovery came slowly. Thompson and Edwin were jailed in Denver, awaiting trial for murder and conspiracy. Sheriff Callahan brought news that papers found in Thompson's saddlebags detailed plans to force ranchers out of the valley for the railroad's benefit. As Mason regained strength, he and Charlotte fell into a new rhythm, not as employer and employee, nor as man and woman with uncertain futures, but as partners rebuilding what had almost been lost. One evening, while Sophie and Michael slept, Mason walked to the barn and retrieved something he'd been working on in secret. The wooden porch swing had hung empty since Rebecca's death. He'd built it for her during her pregnancy, a place where she would sit in the evenings, humming songs to their unborn child. Now Mason rehung it, adding a second seat beside the first. When Charlotte stepped onto the porch with coffee, she paused at the sight. Mason stood with his hands in his pockets, suddenly uncertain. Charlotte touched the smooth wood, running her fingers along the grain, then sat in the new seat. After a moment's hesitation, Mason lowered himself beside her. The swing creaked but held firm as they rocked gently, shoulders not quite touching. The setting sun painted the mountains gold and purple, cattle moving like shadows across the pasture below. "Thank you," Charlotte said softly. Mason glanced sideways. "For what?" She looked ahead at the land that had almost cost them everything. "For giving me a place to breathe." Mason said nothing, but after a long while he reached down and gave the swing a gentle push, setting them in motion together. 6 months later, the ranch had expanded. New fences enclosed additional pasture. A second barn stood where the old one had burned, and the herd had doubled in size. Mason and Charlotte worked side by side, their partnership forged in fire, now tempered by shared purpose. One evening, as they sat on the swing with Sophie between them and Michael sleeping in Charlotte's lap, Sophie leaned over and sniffed Charlotte's sleeve. "She smells like Mama," she said again, the words no less powerful for their repetition. Mason looked at Charlotte, at the woman who had fought beside him, who had saved his life in more ways than one. "Yes," he said simply, "she does." He reached across the back of the swing, his hand finding Charlotte's shoulder. Not a declaration, not yet, but a promise of protection, respect, and perhaps someday something more. Together they watched the stars emerge above their land, not a family born of blood, but one forged through courage, choice, and the unbreakable bonds of survival. In the wild territory of Colorado, 1876, that was home enough.